Hello again, this is UML Operator. Okay, in our use case here for this state machine, we have a game where we've got crew that need to be assigned from certain guns front and the back to different guns, right? So there's groups that are assigned to, we follow the rules, we're going to hit a particular key, which then reassigns, and then another key, right shift, to send them to the guns that we want to target them for. This is the state machine that we're going to build to accomplish this objective. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do is create a project for this game state. I created a package called game state, and I created a class diagram with class tooling for this particular diagram. Let's go ahead and add a class element, drag and drop it into here, and we're going to call this, I think, just crew member. All right. All right, the next thing we need to do is I'm going to double click on this and bring up dialog box for this. We're going to go to details and we're going to add a couple of attributes. So I select attributes and you'll notice that the features window popped up focused on attributes. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a couple of attributes and let's see, current gun, all right. And right now the scope is private. I could change that to public. And the type is integer. All right, so the next one is to add another attribute, and we're going to call this, I guess, group assignment. I think that makes sense. All right, so now we've had attributes. Let's add some operations. To add operations to our class element, there's a couple of ways. I can double click this and I can open back up the dialog box, go to details, and select operations. You'll notice in the feature window, which is in my screen in the lower right, I went right to the operations tab. And right here, we're going to add a couple of operations and it's just going to be next, cycle through the guns, go ahead and accept the defaults, and then previous to go back to something. In this case, it's going to be guns using the AI in this particular game. Now, let's see, double click again into this. Right now, the default language, software language is Java. We're going to choose JavaScript for the simulator. All right, so now that we have that, let's bring in a state machine. To do this, we're going to right click on the class element. We're going to go to a new child diagram, and we are going to add a state machine. And let's just go ahead and call it state machine, accept the default, and call it anything you want. I'm going to call it state machine. So now we've added a state machine under this class element over on the browser that you can see right here. You can see while we're on the state machine diagram, we have the state toolbox, state machine toolbox. We need to add an initial to get things started. You can call this anything you want. We're just going to leave initial for the start. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add a state. So I'm just going to drag a state in here. And let's call this state crew unloaded. Just means that the crew members are, they're pulled off the guns and they're waiting for their assignment. All right, we're going to add another state to the state machine and we're going to call this here, we're going to call this choose groups because we want to assign them to a specific group of weaponry. So choose group or groups. I'm going to say choose groups. All right. And then we're going to add another state. Just place it in here to get it started. And we're going to call this crew chosen. Crew chosen. All right. And now we have our three states in here to get started. You know what I messed up? We want to choose, bring in a state for these chosen states called crew loaded. So you've got unloaded, pulled away from the guns, and then you've got loaded. So we want to do that. So what I'm going to do is bring these inside this state like that, something like that. Let's see here. What am I missing? So I got to, oh, I've got crew waiting. I have to have a state where they're just waiting. So let's add in, so you're thinking through the flow, each state as you're creating your state model. And I have to have, you know, crew on hold, crew waiting. So these are the states inside once the crew has been assigned. So this makes more sense. All right, let's bring in some transitions. We won't define them. So we're going to bring in this transition. We're going to bring in a transition to crew loaded. And all I'm doing is I'm holding down the left mouse button and then I'm letting go and I'm selecting. You can certainly come over to state relationships and choose transition here. Brings up this where you can drag and drop a transition and it will draw it for you. All right, I want to give myself some more modeling space here within the state diagram. So there we go. All right, again, you can hold down this arrow, drag it and drop it to the state in which you want to transition. We're not dealing with these other relationships. We're only dealing with transition. All right, so let's see here. We're going to have a return transition. So I want to draw that in. And we're certainly going to have a return transition here. I want to draw that in. And we are going to have a transition. Once the crew is chosen, you could have a transition where you just stop and you go all the way back to crew waiting. So let's draw in this transition. I want to change this line type here. So I'm going to right click on it, line style, and I want to choose Bezier. So Bezier, whatever you want to say, right? So we're going to draw that in, and this line style gives me the ability to do a bend and just pull it out of the other line styles that you see here to make it more clear to the reader. Now I always like to have a final, define a final. So we're going to have an end. I'm just going to leave it called final, the default, and we're going to draw another transition to this as we're defining our transitions. So we're starting to form our state model. We've thought through the states within the state model, the states within the states, and let's start mapping or bringing in some transitions. Now, to help you get started, you can bring in notes to help you understand what each one of the transitions is. So if I right click on this, I can attach a note or constraint, and this dialog pops up, and I'm going to set the default because I just need it on this particular relationship. I don't need it on these others, but I could certainly assign the note to any one of these transitions or relationships or links, if you will, on that. And these are notes, they're not constraints. So we're just going to do this for now and size this up a little bit. And this right here is the initial, right? So what we want to do is we just want to kind of just make a note to ourselves. I can double click on this and it goes to notes here, or it'll have a note pop-up box for you. And that's just telling the audience, I'm going to hold down the N key for 3 seconds. Just a rule, could be a constraint, but a rule in this particular relationship. And I can do that on any of these to help understand as we're building the state model. All right, so the first transition, I'm going to double click it. I'm going to bring in a trigger, right? Not a guard, a trigger called assign. And that's all we're going to put in right here and hit save. So I've got a trigger called assign. I have another trigger, double click on this, another trigger called chosen. We've selected, the group that we wanted. On return, we've got actually 2 triggers. We've got one, of course, assign or assigned. That's one, hit save, hit new. And we have another one dealing with group. If you're moving back and you're choosing, going back to another group or what have you. So we're going to hit save on that one. So we have 2, assign and group, and I want that down below. So just drag and drop it. And then this trigger is stop. I mean, it's just basically, you just stop doing anything and it will move back to this state. All right. So, and then you can certainly stop while you're here. So I want to create a trigger here for stop so I can transition back to, hey, the crew's just standing there waiting for assignment. Now in this state diagram, the state machine, we're going to have transitions on states. So what I want to do is grab the arrow, and I'm actually going to drop it back on itself and create a transition, right? So I'm going to have two transitions, and let me move this down a little bit, move this down a little bit. So because I want to have another transition, I'm going to go ahead and move this transition up here. I'm going to move another transition down here, and I'm going to drag this down a little bit more, move this right here, and just size this transition, right? And I can certainly come in here and add a line style of Bezier, and one right here, line style Bezier, and I can do something like that just to make it easier to read and understand in this particular case. Same thing goes with crew chosen. So I need to move this over here to the end to give myself some room. All right, I have a transition here. I want to move this to the top because I have the same type of transition for both of these. So I've got another transition here, and let's size these a little bit. And let's just go ahead and give these line styles, right? Now, if I was to hit apply the line style to the same connector type, it would change all of the connector types for transition to Bezier, and I don't want to do that, right? So what I'm going to do is just do each one of them, right? Default is custom on it. We want to choose this line style. So I want to point out something in the Sparks tooling. So when we defined the class and we were using features and operations, features windows looks like this. So you've got the attributes we created and the operations we created. When you're in a state machine, states use the feature window for behavior, internal triggers, and connection points. So we're going to just focus on behavior in this demonstration. And in this particular state, we have an entry. So I'm just going to use entry. As we're entering this state, the first state, it has an entry. All right. And how do I know that? Well, we have an initial to this state and a transition to this state. All right. All right, I'm going to move this out here outside that line so it's clear. So this state, I'm not going to define an entry, do, or exit behavior, but I am going to have one for this transition on this state. So what I do is I just double click on this. You can see it's focused on this. I get transition properties that comes out, and I want to put a trigger. And so what I stated earlier when we were creating this is that it has a previous trigger, and the next one will have a next trigger. Now, from a behavior perspective for this, and we're using JavaScript, I'm just going to use this and then just simply put in previous as a function. And then from a coding perspective, I'm going to go ahead and save this, hit OK. So now we have that within explaining our transition, and we're going to do the same down here for the next. Just double click it. The trigger is next, and I want to use cap, and the behavior is this next function, semicolon, and there we go. We've got this one. Just put it here out of the way, and let's be consistent, do something like that. All right. The same thing is going to apply for these transitions on this state. All right, added those on this next state here, crew chosen. Let's finish up. We're going to add one for here. So this one's called launch as the trigger. I'm just going to do that, hit OK. And this is the final. Double click, open up the transition properties. And this one, I'm just going to literally put in how to end it. Right shift basically finishes the assignment. All right, I think we're ready for our first pass. We're in the simulate tab right here. Run simulation. Let's go ahead and start it and step through it. So it had the initial, it's holding at the state crew loaded, and I have a trigger that I added called launch. So in the lower right where my mouse is, I'm going to go ahead and launch this. I launch this just by double clicking on it, and it launches the crew loaded state where the initial ran to crew waiting, and there's an entry there. Here I have two choices. One is launch. I'm sorry, one is assign. One is assign right here, and one is right shift to enter, to end rather. So if I launch this, it ends, and it ends the simulation. Done. You know, we took the crew off the guns and we just stopped and said, now they need to get back on the guns, and we just hit right shift and they're back on the guns, ready for battle. Okay, so Sparks gives you a couple of windows. So we saw this window over here when we're running, and then it gives you another window. For me, it's over on the right side, lower right as well, in this workspace setup. And it's actually stepping through what's going on within your state machine, right? So I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to clear results. I'm going to go back to this window. I'm going to right click and I'm going to clear the trigger list. Now I have a workspace configuration for simulation. So I'm going to go ahead and launch it. And what it's doing right now is it's bringing these windows out so that I'm able to use them during my simulation, all right? So it has the simulation events down at the bottom right here, and it has the simulation results in this window right here, all right? So we're gonna go ahead and run this again. So I'm on the Simulate tab in the Run Simulation group right here. We're gonna go ahead and hit Start. So you can see it's running the simulation, and it stopped at the launch. So it's waiting for a trigger. I'm going to go ahead and double click on launch. It's running into the crew loaded. It's telling you that here, and it's running into the first state within this state, all right? So it's waiting for two trigger events. One is assign and one is right shift, which basically ends the simulation. Let's assign. So it's exercising this transition. It's moved to choose groups, and you can have instructions in here and it will tell you what to do and things like that, but we're keeping this simple. So in this case, I have a trigger called chosen. I have next within the state. So next, next group in this particular case, previous, let's go back. You're able to cycle through and run next and so on. So I'm getting a simulation error about sim next, and let's read what this is telling me. It's not a function of the expression. So that's just some coding I can do. It's not going to really stop the simulation from working, but you can monitor the errors within your simulation this way, right? So we're going to have the chosen. We've chosen the group that we want to use. So it's waiting for this trigger. We're going to double click on chosen. And it's gone into chosen, and here we have the ability to go cycle again. Next group, previous group. I can stop, and it's going to send me back to crew waiting. The crew's just standing there waiting for it to happen. I'm going to assign. I've chosen my group. They're ready to go. I'm going to hit right shift, which the function in the AI is, attach them to the gun, the weapon that you selected. And we've simulated this pattern. We've simulated the state using the AI in the game to understand. And then from here, we can actually start building some macros or some code to support the game experience. Now, there's a lot more coding and behavior we could do. We could, these errors right here aren't important to me right now. But I want to expose the behavior at least in crew unloaded and then crew waiting for you. So as you're coding through this and building out more defined simulations, you're allowed to do this. So if I double click on this again, as I've shown you earlier, I'm able to get to features where I can look at features and behavior, right? So I'm going to go to entry because I chose entry here. If I right click on here, I could hit F10 as the shortcut, but I want to look at the operation. So I'm going to bring the operation up. The operation dialog box pops up for entry. I can go to code in this particular case, and I can say, hey, this is current gun from my class equals 0, whatever indicator or value that you want to have here. And I'm going to save this, and I want the same thing to be exposed in my code for behavior, under behavior, because I want to show behavior in the diagram, right? Now I'm going to hit save, and I now see the behavior within this particular state. I don't want to do the same for the next one, and I'm going to do that next. All right, I did it for the next state, crew waiting. And again, current gun, that, remember, that came from our class diagram. It was our first attribute, current gun as an integer. You could certainly have different types, and I could have put group assignment instead of integers as an alphanumeric representation. I have my functions, next and previous. This is going to various guns, group selections. You could certainly code more into here, but we don't need it for this simulation demonstration. Okay, so let's see here. We created a class element called crew member. We created a state diagram underneath that. We built in the various transitions and triggers and things associated to that. You can see we built all of that under this class element. Let's go back to this class element. Let's go to Develop tab. Let's go to Generate. Let's generate a single element. So the one we have selected, could go up here, single element. It's crew member. We chose JavaScript as the target language. See right here. For that, let's write this. We're going to write it to our demo folder. We're going to write to our target. We can go ahead and double check. This is the folder we want to write to. It took the name for the code script, JavaScript that we're going to create. We're going to hit save, and we're going to hit generate. So it generated the code. Now if we go onto this and we hit function key 12, F12, we're able to look at the simulation code that we created while we built the simulation, including any behavioral documentation, that we put in for this code. All right, so we've assumed that we have assigned the crew to the particular guns. We're going to select and launch this. So we've held down the N key. We've targeted what guns they need to be on. We're hitting the necessary triggers to get them to the guns. Once they're there, we're selecting right shift to end the simulation. Now, I've had some people ask how I configured my simulation workspace, and it seems that the workspace, the system workspace for simulation doesn't work. And I haven't used it in so long, I didn't know that. They said that when they tried to launch it, they were getting an error. So I don't use that. I create my own, and let me show you how I do that. So I start in one of my default common work spaces to use as a baseline, if you will, or a base to build on. We're going to go to the Simulate tab. We're in Dynamic Simulation, and I'm simply going to select Simulator. Now that pops up here for me, and what I like to do is move this tab just to the right of the work area. And then I want to make it as small as I can. I don't need the right side that big, so we'll start with something like this. All right. So the next thing I do is I bring in simulation events. So we're going to select events. It's popping up in the lower right here in this situation. It may pop up in other places. I like to move this right below the diagram, and I have a rather large monitor, so I can put it right about this depth, if you will. And the next thing I do is I bring in the call stack. So if I select the call stack, it pops up here in the upper right for me, and I like to move the call stack just to the right of simulation events. And you can make this because I don't need simulation events that wide. About this width should be fine. You can always adjust it, right? And the next thing I do is I want to make sure I have features down in the lower right. So we're going to get that window and bring that window up next. So to do that, we're going to go to the start. We're going to go to the all windows panel, properties. We're going to select features. And now I have features in the lower right. And as I had shown you earlier, that this window is dynamic and will change between using class elements versus using state elements. Feature window changes for entry, do, exit, and provides other tooling for you. Next thing is I'm going to go back to simulate, and I want to bring in local variables. And for me, it pops up in the upper right, and that's where I want it. I just slide this tab over to the far right because I want browser, pan and zoom, inspector, and then local variables. So when we save this, it will remember that I want to be on local variables, that I want to be on features in the lower right, simulation is set right, and call stack is good enough right now, as well as simulation events. So because we have simulator up here, we do not need the run simulation panel because now we have all of that tooling up here. So if you've got minimum workspace, I happen to have a large monitor, you can certainly right click up here in the ribbon, minimize that, and it opens up some workspace for you that's a little larger and more appealing to the eye. And again, you can minimize toolbox, leave toolbox pin back out. It's up to you. So you have lots of options here in configuring your workspace. I like having ribbon out, so I'm going to click this off and show it. And what we do now is we're going to go back to start. We're going to select workspaces, my workspaces, and I have one already set down here. I'm going to delete it because I'm just going to create a new one. So create new. We're going to call it simulation, include active custom views, and we're going to hit save. Now I'm able to move between various workspace configurations. In this case, I'm going back to my common, which has browser on the upper right, notes. It's set up this way. We're going to launch our new simulation workspace, simulation. It's running through and configuring that for us. And now we have it set back to exactly where we want to start when we're doing simulations. Now, when we run the simulation, we can run it from the simulation window. I'm going to go ahead and select it, and it's stepping through the simulation. You're seeing your local variables. We did not configure local variables today, so values are empty. But let's go ahead and just continue to step through this. So we're over on a simulation event. We have a waiting trigger called launch. I'm going to go ahead and launch it. It's showing through simulation what it's stepping through. It's showing you the call stack. It's currently waiting at crew waiting. And we're going to assign a crew. Then it's at choose groups. And then we're ready to go. We don't need to go back and forth between the groups. We're just going to hit the trigger event that completes the assignment, and we're done. So it's letting you know in the simulation that the simulation is ended and the call stack is clear, and the state machine is back to where it was at start. In this session, we just scratched the surface. There is so much more you can do. You can look at your state diagrams and run through this way. If you right click in the white space of the diagram, you're going to have this option that shows up now in the pop-up menu where you can move from diagram to various views. Let's go into state, next state, and you're in this view right here. Now when we're running through simulation, it's actually stepping through a matrix, if you will. As you're going through the call stack, it's showing what is happening state to next state. You can right click in here. You can change the state chart editor to state to trigger. Now we're in state to trigger view where you have your state to your trigger across the top. Let me stop this so that it's clear for you. So you have your triggers across the top and your states down through the column. Now when you're running this, it's showing you the states on the left through the various triggers as you're going through the triggers and showing the simulation this way. I'm going to go ahead and stop you and show the next one. So right click anywhere in the white space, state chart editor, I'm left mouse overing it. We're going to go to trigger to state. Now when you're in trigger to state, you have triggers on the left, state across the top. So you can slice and dice your state machines any way you want. So now it's going this way. I can go through the various trigger events, sign. It's running through and showing you the states across the top this time, triggers on the left, right shift, and it ends. All right, so the state machine is done. So there's lots of different ways you can slice and dice how you view your state machines. I'm going to do it again, right click in the white space, state chart editor, go back to diagram. So you can slice and dice your views, run your simulations any way you wish, code edit throughout, the whole event. You can generate code if you're doing that. You certainly don't have to generate code. You don't need this if you're not going to reuse the code. But you can slice and dice your state machines, add more dynamics to it, more simulation and automation, utilize tag values and script automation. There's so much more to do. I may touch on this as we progress in this channel. If you go back to the EA example file that Sparks gives you, and we've talked about quite a bit, you can go to Simulate, Simulator, find simulations, and then look for various simulations. A really cool one is Login. The Login Simulator, customer login down here. Let's just go ahead and launch this one. This one's pretty cool. What it does is, let's go ahead and run this one. So I'm going to run this simulator, and what they give you is a login window that pops up that you can use in the simulator. So it'll tell you, you can put in various usernames, and you can, let's do a password fail event. So you have 3 login attempts, and what it does is it's running through, it failed, and now you have 2 login attempts that are left. And if you follow the rules that they set for the simulation, and the password is secret, if I remember correctly, and now we log in, it will go through and it completed. So you look over here at your simulation, it ran through, you had a fail, you run it again, log in, and it passed and simulated ended. So very cool. You're able to look through the events as they're taking place, trigger the events as they're going through, and simulating the events. There's no local values that were put here. They're using tag values to support the simulation event, which I think they tell you in the pop-up window they create. But in this case, they're actually using a wireframe for Win32. You could use a wireframe for web, and you could simulate login events. You can simulate shopping events, adding an item to cart. There's so much that you can do. Again, I'll try to touch on it in future videos if we have time. So much to talk about. I certainly have gone over my 30-minute threshold, but I hope that you're able to follow all the way through. I'll put chapters down below that you can skip ahead. So let's recap. We touched on creating a class element for our state machine. We assigned a state machine as a child diagram under the class element. I wasn't able to show you all of the notes that you can add, but you can add as many notes as you want, even constraints. We didn't get into that talk about your transitions, your triggers. And the other thing we didn't get time to talk about is the crew simulation or the executable state machine artifact. This is an artifact that's included in the toolbox down in the simulation window, down here in the simulation section, that brings in an executable state diagram which you're able to define, put lots of notes in here, intelligence, assign a language to the state machine, executable, bring in a class, the class element. This is the same class element that we defined earlier. We're just bringing it as a generalized object, but we didn't have time to get into this subject. It's not necessary for what we concluded in this particular exercise. We stepped through a configuration to your workspace. It's more productive. That adds in your simulator with all of your run simulator tooling up here, your ability to move between manual, interpreted, which is default, and executable. Let you play with that yourself. We went through the simulation event toolbox, the call stack toolbox, of course, simulation that shows you how things are going when you're running a simulation through your particular trigger events, all the way through, hey, I'm done, final, it ends. We introduced the local variables that run through when you're running your simulation to bring in local variables on the attributes that you may be assigned during coding and behavior. And let's see here, feature box, we touched about the feature box, and let me go ahead and stop this up here. That features within a state machine deal with types entry, do, and exit. We covered quite a bit, I think, in a very short period of time. Go over to EA example that showed you a moment ago. Play around with this state machines, the simulation examples that they have there. I think all of them are working. I don't go there anymore, just in these video sessions to show you. It's a great place to look at alternatives and things that the fantastic people, developers at Spark Systems and the contributors have provided for you to help you learn to achieve model-driven development. Thanks very much for watching, and look forward to seeing you in the next session.